A bad general manager can wreck a franchise for years, and that is why this list lands harder than the usual coach or player debate. A coach can ruin one season, a bad captain can split a room, a bad trade can haunt you for a while, a bad GM can do all of it at once. He can miss on draft picks, throw money at the wrong veterans, move good players too early, hold on to bad ones too long, and leave the next guy with a roster that makes no sense and a cap sheet that looks even worse. This list is about damage and how long it sticks. So here are the 10 worst GMs in NHL history, with a heavier lean toward the cap era and the last 20 to 30 years, because that is where a lot of the ugliest, easiest to track mistakes live. Some of these names had one move that followed them forever. Some built entire runs on bad timing, bad contracts, and bad reads. A couple survived longer than they should have. One still owns the top spot, unless somebody decides to burn down 3 different parts of a franchise at once. At number 10, Pierre Gauthier. Gauthier's run in Montreal was short, which is part of the reason he lands lower than some of the others here. Though short does not mean harmless. He took over the Canadiens in February 2010, inherited a team that had just gone to the Eastern Conference Final, and 2 years later, he was out after Montreal finished dead last in the East and missed the playoffs for the first time since 2007. A collapse that sharp gets remembered. So does the mess around his final months, when the Randy Cunneyworth coaching move detonated into a full political and hockey sideshow in Quebec, and the whole organization looked scattered. He did have one deep playoff run on his watch in 2010-11, which is what keeps him from climbing higher. There was at least 1 year where the team still looked functional. Once that wore off, the flaws took over fast. For a franchise like Montreal, dead last in the Eastern Conference is enough to get your name on a list like this, especially when the whole point of the job is supposed to be keeping the floor higher than that. At number 9, Brian Lawton. Lawton's time in Tampa Bay was brief and messy. He became GM in October 2008. By April 2010, new owner Jeff Vinik fired him after the Lightning missed the playoffs for a third straight season. Tampa already had Steven Stamkos. It had Martin St. Louis. It had Vincent Lecavalier. It had enough talent that fresh start became the phrase ownership used the second it cleaned out the front office and the bench. This is the kind of tenure that can get forgotten because it did not last long, and because Steve Yzerman walked in right after and changed the whole direction of the franchise. That contrast is exactly why Lawton belongs here. Same market, same core pieces, different front office. One setup went nowhere. The next one built a modern contender and eventually a cup team. That gap says a lot. At number 8, Doug MacLean. Expansion teams buy their GMs some time, and Columbus gave MacLean plenty of it. He was the founding architect, took over the hockey side before the Blue Jackets even hit the ice, and lasted through 6 seasons without making the playoffs once. Reuters had the final line cleanly when he was fired in 2007. 6 years, no postseason, and a 172, 258, and 62 record. That is not a rough patch. That is a whole era. The larger problem with MacLean is that Columbus spent years stuck in the middle of bad and irrelevant without building much of a foundation around Rick Nash. High picks kept coming, progress did not. The Blue Jackets were still miles from serious contention when he left. And for an expansion GM who had years to shape every part of the organization, from draft board to identity, that is hard to defend. At number 7, John Ferguson Jr. Leafs fans have their own ranking system for GMs, and Ferguson is always near the top for the wrong reasons. Sportsnet's old Maple Leafs GM breakdown listed the move right there with his tenure summary. Tuukka Rask for Andrew Raycroft. That trade is enough by itself to bury a reputation, because it was not some tiny misread. Rask became one of the best goalies of his era. Raycroft gave Toronto one decent season, and then the team started spending more assets trying to clean up the crease. That part matters because Ferguson did not just make the Rask trade. He also chased Vesa Toskala with more picks and kept throwing resources at fixes that did not hold. Reuters Archive has the Leafs firing him in January 2008. Sportsnet's breakdown has his tenure at 145, 110, 30, and 10, and ties it directly to the Rask-Raycroft deal and the follow-up goalie scrambling. Toronto under him felt expensive, impatient, and unsteady, which is one of the easiest ways to waste the middle of a decade in that market. At number 6, Garth Snow. Snow lasted 12 years on Long Island, and long tenures can sometimes fool people into thinking the job was steadier than it really was. It was not. The Islanders fired him in 2018, and the raw numbers attached to his run tell the story. 4 playoff appearances in 12 years and only 1 series win. NHL.com noted Snow's firing when Lou Lamoriello stepped in, and that alone tells you how much patience had already been spent. Then there is the contract everybody remembers. Rick DiPietro got 15 years and $67.5 million in 2006. The deal became a league-wide warning label.
He got the label of bust.
DiPietro played 50 NHL games total after 2008, and the Islanders eventually used a compliance buyout to get out from under the remaining years. Snow's defenders usually point to John Tavares and a few later draft hits. Fair enough. The long run still produced very little team success, and the DiPietro contract hangs over the whole thing anyway. At number 5, Chuck Fletcher. Fletcher's Philadelphia run was one long argument against half measures. He took over the Flyers in late 2018, made the playoffs once, and by March 2023, he was out after one of the worst trade deadlines any GM has survived to the end of the week. Sportsnet's post-firing breakdown laid the whole thing out. 1 playoff appearance, 4 coaching changes, 33 trades, more than 90 contracts, a roster that never settled on a clear direction. Once you get into the move list, it gets worse. Ryan Ellis cost assets and gave the Flyers 4 games. Rasmus Ristolainen cost a first and a second, then got a 5-year extension. Tony DeAngelo came in on a trade and extension. Shane Gostisbehere had to be dumped with a second-round pick attached. Kevin Hayes got 7 years. Claude Giroux's exit came late. The James Van Riemsdyk non-trade at the 2023 deadline became the perfect final image for the whole run. A front office trying to move, failing to move, and somehow making the situation look even worse. At number 4, Jim Benning. Benning lasted 8 seasons in Vancouver, and almost every year of that run had the same problem sitting somewhere in it. Poor cap management, weird roster timing, free agency money spent on players who were never going to move the team far enough. Sportsnet's Canucks breakdowns put names on it quickly. Louis Eriksson at $6 million, Jay Beagle at $3 million, Anton Roussel at $3 million. Those were the kinds of deals that sat in the bottom half of the lineup while the real young core was coming into view. Then came the Oliver Ekman-Larsson trade. Vancouver bundled Eriksson, Beagle, and Roussel into the deal with Arizona, which cleaned up one mess and opened another. Sportsnet framed it at the time as Vancouver improving on paper while taking on real risk, and later Canucks coverage made the cap management issues impossible to ignore. OEL's contract stayed on the books until the Canucks bottom out, spreading the pain over years. Benning did make some good picks. Quinn Hughes, Elias Pettersson, Thatcher Demko, Brock Besser, and Niels Höglander all arrived during his tenure. That is why he does not go higher. The cap mistakes and the overall roster drift were still bad enough that Vancouver fired him in December 2021 with the team last in the Pacific. At number 3, Brad Treliving. I know this one is going to bother some people, though the modern case is strong enough now that I'm not moving him down. Treliving's Calgary run lasted nearly a decade and ended right as the franchise was trying to recover from losing Johnny Gaudreau for nothing and then trading Matthew Tkachuk. The biggest issue from that whole sequence is Jonathan Huberdeau. Calgary acquired him, then rushed him into an 8-year, $84 million extension before seeing how the fit really looked. By February 2026, Reuters had Huberdeau in year 3 of that deal with only 25 points in 50 games before season-ending hip surgery. Then came Toronto. Treliving took over the Leafs in 2023, carried all the pressure that job comes with, and still left in March 2026 with the team sitting 14th in the East and out of the playoff picture. Reuters had his final Toronto line at 129, 82, and 27, with a 10-10 playoff record. A few months earlier, Reuters had Toronto last in the Atlantic in late December and firing assistant coach Marc Savard while the team's power play sat dead last in the league. In most markets, Treliving's regular season record might buy more time. In Toronto, with that payroll and those expectations, it reads more like drift. He did not inherit an easy job. He still added his own problems to it, and that is enough to put him this high. At number 2, Peter Chiarelli. Chiarelli had already won a cup in Boston, which should have made the Edmonton run safer than it turned out to be. Instead, it became one of the clearest examples of a GM burning premium assets around a superstar center. The Oilers fired him in January 2019 with the team below 500. The move everyone starts with is Taylor Hall for Adam Larsson. Hall was 24, a former first overall pick, and one of the few elite forwards the Oilers had developed. Chiarelli traded him 1-for-1 for a defenseman, and Hall went on to win the Hart Trophy in New Jersey. The other move that keeps his name near the top of lists like this is Griffin Reinhart. Edmonton sent the 16th and 33rd picks in the 2015 draft to the Islanders for Reinhart, who played 29 games for the Oilers. Matthew Barzal went with one of those picks. Mitchell Stevens went with the other. Add in bad free agent spending, bad depth trades, and a general inability to build properly around Connor McDavid, and Chiarelli's Edmonton run turns into one of the easiest cases on the board. When you have McDavid and still spend years arguing about support, asset use, and cap waste, the GM is going to wear that. At number 1, Mike Milbury. This spot is still his. If you try to explain Milbury's Islanders years too quickly, it almost sounds fake. He traded Roberto Luongo and Ole Jokinen to Florida, then used the first overall pick in 2000 on Rick DiPietro. He traded Zygmunt Palffy and eventually got less out of that whole sequence than the Kings got out of the scorer they took. He traded Zdeno Chara and the second overall pick, which became Jason Spezza, to Ottawa for Alexei Yashin. Then he signed Yashin to a giant contract that the Islanders eventually bought out anyway. There are GMs on this list who made one franchise-shaping mistake. Milbury stacked them. Hall of Fame goalie out. Hall of Fame defenseman out. Future top-line center out. Replacement contracts in. The damage spread in every direction. Even now, when people write about the worst trades in modern hockey history, the Islanders, under Milbury, show up over and over again. Sportsnet's trade history piece basically says the quiet part out loud. If a deal is considered the worst move Milbury made, that is almost a compliment to the rest of his resume. So that is my 10. Pierre Gauthier, Brian Lawton, Doug MacLean, John Ferguson Jr., Garth Snow, Chuck Fletcher, Jim Benning, Brad Treliving, Peter Chiarelli, Mike Milbury. A few of these guys had one move that never stopped following them. Some left behind entire cap sheets full of damage. A few lasted longer than fans in those cities thought they should. Ownership can wait forever on a bad GM because the evidence takes longer to pile up than it does with a coach. By the time the move comes, the damage is usually all over the roster. That is why these names stick the way they do. Fans are not only remembering a bad trade, they're remembering what the next 3 years looked like after it. They are not only remembering a bad contract, they're remembering who could not be signed because that money was sitting in the wrong place. And they are not only remembering the GM getting fired, they are remembering how long it took to clean the whole thing up.